Hey everybody, Professor Dust here, and today we're going to talk about diversity. So first off, what exactly are the different ways that we can conceptualize diversity? The first one, which I think is probably what people initially think about when we're talking about diversity, is observable characteristics, but you can also look at unobservable characteristics, such as deep level diversity. So for the first topic, demographics, right? These are our gender, race, ethnicity, our age. These are all things that for the most part we feel as if we can guess based upon some surface level evaluation, right? So those are those observable characteristics, but the unobservable characteristics of diversity, those are our deep level diversity concepts. These are our psychographics, our individual characteristics, our values, motivations, personality traits, as well as knowledge, skills, and abilities, whatever those might be, right? So these are the things that we can do, the things that are beneath the surface, the way that we behave. So it's important to understand those differences because they have different abilities in terms of fairness, right? We want surface level diversity for fairness so that protected classes are not disadvantaged. And then as well, deep level diversity is great when you're actually trying to make sure that you have different perspectives, different ideas, regardless of what the surface level characteristics are of the individuals. So here's a few trends that I think everyone should be aware of as of today for where we're headed and how things are changing or not changing. So number one, our workforce is getting older, so baby boomers, right? There is a very large portion of the population that are baby boomers that are still working, but they're gradually retiring. So if you were to evaluate, what's going on in terms of age trends within the workforce, arguably at the moment they are we're relatively older than what we've ever been because we have so many in this baby boomer category, but they are retiring quickly, and so it is getting younger and younger and younger. And once all those baby boomers are gone, we're going to switch to being a very young workforce pretty quickly based upon the proportion. And then another one is that the number of minorities are increasing in the workplace, and that is across every racial class that you can imagine, and that's a great thing. That is ensuring that we're becoming more diverse for these surface level characteristics, which is good in overall terms of fairness and equity. And as well, gender is another one where at this point I think it's 51%, if not 52% at this point, that is females in the workforce versus males in the workforce, which 100 years ago it was not that way. Number three, white males still are more likely than any other to be promoted. So although diversity trends and initiatives are certainly top of mind, and there's lots of work and lots of research going into understanding surface level diversity, we are not there yet. The glass ceiling, so to speak, this concept of minorities can get promoted, but once they get to a certain point, they can see it, but they just can't get there. They can't break the glass, is still real, right? So here in 2021, it's crazy to think about the fact that Kamala Harris is the first VP or president that we've ever had, where in many other developed countries, that was happening, decades ago. So yes, there's a lot of work to do, certainly here in the U.S. as well as across the globe. So what exactly is the business case for diversity? I think people make these arguments based upon relatively simplified arguments, and we really need to break down what is the business case for having diversity. How can it help your organization when you have a even distribution of whether it is gender or race or some other protected class? So a source of competitive advantage that is purported but isn't always 100% there is unique perspectives and unique talents. So certainly if you have diversity from a surface level, you might be able to get people that are speaking to different types of backgrounds based upon their opinion, or speak to different opinions and perspectives based upon their background in a specific minority, for example. And then the challenge, though, is making sure that they actually have the capacity to speak up and the in the platform once they're there, right? So the competitive advantage isn't automatic. There has to be this opportunity for it actually to come to fruition. Another is this idea of diversity can help decision-making and creativity and innovation, because again, the more diverse we are, the more we have different perspectives. And I think a lot of those first two are much easier when we're talking about deep-level diversity and much harder when we're talking about surface-level diversity. But ideally, you get a little bit of both contributing to this source of competitive advantage. And then the other one is this understanding the market. So I think IBM is probably touted as doing this the best in purposefully hiring people of specific protected classes, not just because they believe in fairness and they want to give everybody an equal opportunity, but it was strategic. They wanted to make sure that the potential users of their product and services had those specific demographics, because they wanted to understand from that specific minority's perspective, how do you use our product, how is it perceived, how does it fit your lifestyle, or whatever it might be. So you can, I think if you're big enough, really make sure that you're hiring and creating subgroups to say, hey, we want you to almost be the pilot for understanding how this works, right? So it's a little bit of a different approach, but it can be beneficial. Another reason that diversity is helpful in terms of the business case is in terms of performance. So people will work harder, people will more motivation, people will feel like they can be their true self or be more authentic when the overall organization has an attitude that inclusion and belongingness is important. So there's great research out there illustrating that yes, people want to be a part of that organization. They're more committed to the organization. They believe in its mission when they can see that diversity initiatives are happening, and then that's an important priority for organizations, which then again leads to these wonderful outcomes, dependent variables of authenticity or feelings of authenticity, acting with authenticity, higher motivation and effort. But diversity is not simple, so there definitely are challenges, and these are things to be aware of so we can start to figure out solutions for overcoming and just maximize those benefits and get away from some of the detriments. So how can diversity hurt the organization in terms of team performance? So number one, when you have work groups, whether it be a team or a division or some defined unit, the more surface level diversity you have, the less integration or communication. So when people are more attracted to building relationships with and communicating with those that are similar to them. We do it with our friend groups all the time. And there's nothing wrong with having a group of friends that acts like you, looks like you, and is interested in the same things. That's part of the reason you're probably friends. You're more comfortable with that. But in a work setting, that psyche, that attraction, similarity, drive is problematic. And it can lead to subgroups of people working together or not working together based upon their demographic characteristics. And it can cause conflict because then you have these like dueling camps on, that I trust them, but I don't trust them. Another one is that there's really not a consistent effect on cohesion or performance. It depends on a moderating variable, right? So as team diversity, surface level diversity increases, you would hope that performance also increases, or at least that's what we expect. But the moderating variable would be this sense of inclusion or belongingness, or what's also called social integration. So you really have to have not just diversity, but this sense of social integration or inclusion to make sure that you can overcome some of these challenges and make sure that you are actually benefiting from diversity of thought. So another thing to think about is this idea that when you have diversity, sometimes it can create what are called fault lines. And this is when you see a separation within some unit or within some organization or within some team that has subgroups, or maybe it's bimodal, or maybe there's 3 groups in there. Take an example of a university that maybe is primarily white and from the US, and they are bringing in students that are international students, perhaps from China or from another country, from the Middle East, whatever it might be. And if you take a step back and you say, are we diverse? You can see the percentages start to increase of these non-white populations within an entire institution. But if you really kind of peel back the layers on how are they working together and integrating, arguably you might start to see fault lines where, again, as a whole there's diversity, but really what you have is you have the majority still all working together, you have this minority working together, and you have this minority working together. That's not the point of diversity, just to fill a percentage. The goal of diversity is to have everybody integrating and working together, okay? So this last bullet here, intergroup, inter-subgroup antagonism, would mean that you would have two different groups, inter, and there's between inter subgroup antagonism, meaning they're not necessarily working together, they're kind of battling it out. And then you also can have intra-subgroup competition. So that means within a specific subgroup you start to see people competing, perhaps because they assume that their resources are dwindling, so they have to compete within their subgroup. So these are all the challenges, right? These aren't easy things to figure out. And a lot of times when we create diversity initiatives, it's well-intentioned, but we're not considering some of these downstream effects that we actually also have to solve for, or it's not necessarily going to have the intended effect or be as useful as we would expect. Another thing to consider in terms of diversity challenges is what happens to the individual that is dissimilar to the masses, or that are to the, so let me put it a different way. If you are typically in the majority, and let's say as a white male, I'm typically in the majority no matter what social unit I'm in within the organizational work environment, and you're working within an environment where all of a sudden you are the minority. This was me at my PhD program, for example. So I was the token white male, but within my PhD program it was primarily female. There was lots of people from Iran and China and India. And there was all sorts of diversity going on in all sorts of great ways, and then all of a sudden the person that's usually the majority is in the minority. Well, interestingly, that has some really fascinating psychological effects on that person that used to be in the majority. They actually end up having less productivity, less commitment. Their perceptions of advancement starts to decline, again because they've been conditioned to have this stature within the overall community, whatever they're embedded within, and then now it's a big change, and so they're having a hard time adjusting to it. And then similarly, if you're a white male minority, which typically is the majority, or it used to be the majority in most organizations, especially large or publicly traded organizations, research is suggesting that absenteeism is increasing, the intent to leave the organization is increasing, showing that there is a little bit of challenge in helping those that used to be in the majority get comfortable with this increase in diversity, which is another problem we need to solve. And then also there's some research, I've conducted some research with my colleagues on what happens when you have employee-supervisor gender dissimilarity. So males and females as the employee, don't seem to have a problem with males as the supervisor. They tend to get along, they have a good relationship quality, and females really like it when they have a female supervisor, but males as employees are sometimes struggling when they have a female supervisor, because it goes against what they're used to in terms of the social trends, right? So these are all problems and they need to be solved, and they're not easy problems to solve, but we can't ignore that there are these diversity challenges that are taking place, because research is showing that these are having an impact on satisfaction and performance and commitment. So there's a few legal approaches in terms of like how do we make sure that diversity is actually happening, and you should know both of these. So equal employment opportunity, or EEO. If you see a job application, you might see some kind of language saying, hey, we are an EEO compliant employer, or something along those lines. This is a federal legislation, and to paraphrase what it suggests is that it forbids discrimination on the basis of protected classes: sex, race, color, religion, national orientation, disability, and age, in terms of that employment relationship. So in terms of hiring them, in terms of firing them, promotion, demoting, all those things, right? That's EEO. Then there's also what's called affirmative action. This is an executive order, and it's a little bit different than EEO. This affirmative action executive order is requiring government contractors to intentionally seek out and hire qualified employees from some of these protected classes that are typically underrepresented within the organization. So it's more about the opportunity, where the equal employment opportunity is more about that transactional employment relationship. So there are legal approaches to trying to make sure that diversity is happening and that diversity is moving in the right direction. And then there's also of business approaches as well, which we'll walk through here in a second. But here's an example of a legal approach, and I want you to stew on this and think about the good and the bad. So California was the first state, it's probably been a few years now, to put into law that a corporate board within the state, right? If you are a registered entity in the state of California, so you have a board of directors based upon your articles of incorporation, it was the first law to put into place that that board must include at least one female. And then I'm sure since then it's evolved. There's all sorts of different states that are putting out similar laws but tweaking it. Something along the lines of it needs to be a certain percentage, it needs to be a certain number, or whatever it ends up being and getting debated within that specific state. And so what are the pros and cons of mandating diversity through some type of legal means? So for one, it's potentially good in that you got to start somewhere, and if it's not happening because our psychology sometimes does weird things and is making it not possible, well, creating some type of legal push to go in that direction can certainly make sure that it happens. Now, it's not perfect, because the downside sometimes is that, if you did have a token female, for example, that's put onto the board in California in this case, they might feel as if, well, did I really earn it? And then maybe the other people that are on the board that are all male are saying, well, they don't really deserve it. We're not going to listen to this person. The only reason they're there is because of the law. So it's not perfect, and at the same time, at least some type of initiative is happening and some type of movement is happening, but there will always be debates on what's the right way for this to go down. Should it be organic? Should it be a legal approach? But I think over time, the best case is that we have a little bit of everything. We experiment, we iterate, and try and figure out how to at least reach the end goal, regardless of the bumps along the road. So here's another interesting case for you to consider, where this is more of a business approach, not necessarily a legal approach, that is attempting to try and help with diversity initiatives. So Google and Facebook, I think, were some of the two, or at least the most well-known, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, to start implementing a new employee benefit, right? So organizations, when they have people working for them, they are, for the most part, in charge of offering some type of health benefits, life insurance, disability, dental, vision, right? They offer these benefit packages. And they, a lot of times, get to determine what they want those benefits to be. And especially when you're this big and you have an organization of this size, you're essentially your own insurance company. And you can basically write exactly what you want the contract to be on what health claims are covered for your employees. Well, the employee benefit that some of these large organizations started to offer was an attempt to help females in leadership positions or to have career advancement. They started offering to pay anywhere between $10,000 and $20,000, sometimes $30,000 or more in egg freezing for females that were interested in having their eggs frozen, so that when they were ready to start a family, they could use in vitro fertilization later down the road and be in more control of the timing of when they were going to have children, right? So this is super creative, and there's lots of debate going both ways on, is this weird? Is this okay? Or is this a good thing, right? Some people would say this is empowering females to be able to start their family, which is very time consuming and can take females out of the leadership track, can create career derailment. They lose that momentum at a critical point in their career. So now we're giving them, one opportunity, one resource for being able to have the timing decision in their court. And so we're going to pay this really, really expensive benefit that is not ever usually covered by an organization. But then the alternative is, this is weird that organizations are even attempting to have any say or any influence on family planning, and the other one being, this really isn't getting at the source of the problem. Ideally, what happens is that we change the culture, we change the mentality, we make things more flexible for females and males, and that really should be the solution. It should be more systemic. It shouldn't be this band-aid to say, hey, you can have kids whenever you want. And also, it's not foolproof, right? If you cultivate eggs and try and get in vitro fertilization, it could potentially decrease the likelihood that it actually works, right? So it's a tricky thing. That are you maybe incentivizing females to work more or work through the ideal family planning stages of their life, and maybe almost adding to the probability that they might not have success. So it is a weird conversation, but people are trying to get creative to come up with ways to do it. So again, pros and cons of every approach. So what can organizations really do to manage diversity? Here's the list of things that should be happening regardless. Number one, top management team has to buy into the vision of the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. We've talked about this in leadership sections. It is a trickle-down philosophy, right? They are in charge, and whatever they are doing, it signals the importance for lower levels down. If they're signaling the importance of flexibility, signaling the importance of inclusion, it will trickle down to layers below. And then there has to be some degree of training and education. It's a complicated topic. I think we all understand what diversity is on the surface, but we don't necessarily understand the layers of cognitive bias. What are those biases? How do we overcome? What are the pros and cons of different approaches? So the more that everybody has a language, the higher likelihood we have of making sure that people can make good decisions and make informed decisions on what to do. It's important to assess. What are your numbers? How are you doing? Evaluate the process. When you send out applications, who's applying? Maybe that is signaling something about your visibility in terms of whether you will be inclusive or not. Who do you end up bringing in for interviews? Who do you end up hiring? What types of demographics are getting promoted? What types of demographics are leaving? You got to assess. If you keep the score gets better. However, it's dangerous to create quotas within organizations. A lot do, but a lot also will run into problems if they're only focused on the number, right? There has to be a process behind it that is helping get that number, and it's good to have goals, but to set quotas can be problematic because you might actually say, well, this isn't the right person for the job, but we're going to fill them in because we got to reach that quota. So I think there's a really fine line between using quotas and using goals. There's a difference there. So I gave some of those examples. Track applicants and hires, track employees in terms of demographics at team, unit, and organizational level, because again, you got to keep the score and see how we're doing. Another one is equal access to formal and informal networks. I think a lot of times it's hard to make sure that everybody feels as if they can get an opportunity across the organization to participate in whatever it is, whether it's a formal leadership development program or an informal mentorship opportunity, or there historically has always been going out for drinks on a Friday night. Well, yeah, that might work for single people, or that might work for the males who have partners at home who are with children. But that's not the case anymore, right? So we have to create new opportunities, right? We have dual income earner households. We have to have equitable opportunities to engage in these types of scenarios. So I think that's changing a lot, and people are recognizing that, which is a good sign. And then finally, focusing on inclusion and belongingness. Diversity is not enough. Just because you have all these multicolored diverse puzzle pieces doesn't mean it's going to work out great in terms of creating this beautiful picture. They have to be linked together in some way that then creates this wonderful image, right? It has to be inclusive, it has to be connected, or they're going to leave, right? You can bring people in to fill quotas, but then they'll just go out the other end because, this isn't an inclusive place. I don't feel like my diversity is being appreciated. What can individuals do to also mitigate these challenges associated with cognitive bias related to diversity. So this image here is Joe Biden and Kamala Harris in the Democratic presidential debates. You'll read an article this week that I wrote for Business Insider about how to mitigate our cognitive biases about gender differences for leadership. And the political debates are a great way to investigate. It's a great lens through which we can think about how did we react to the way that people were posturing within presidential debates. There was this very interesting moment in the debates that got talked about a lot, which ended up being ironic because now Kamala Harris is the VP and Biden's the president, where Kamala Harris attacked Joe Biden very fiercely on his busing voting records and created a moment where it became a meme where it was saying, that was me, that was me, that was, I was that little girl that was being bussed or something along those lines. And so she went on the attack. And it was interesting to see the reaction where people were saying, wow, that was very abrasive, it was very aggressive. And this happens all the time, right? Males get more of the leeway when they start acting aggressive or agentic, where females, it doesn't align with our perceptions of what the communal, caring female is supposed to do. That's problematic, right? And so here are the 4 things that we could be doing, when we're evaluating how we're perceiving those that are in the minority or perceiving those that are in this where we're trying to prevent cognitive bias or we're trying to increase diversity. So the first one is to have a self-critical mindset and recognize that cognitive bias is inevitable, right? Just because you don't necessarily, because you believe in diversity, because you know that you're a good person. All of us, for the most part, are, we're just doing the best we can and we believe in doing good things and we believe in fairness. But even so, all of us are still susceptible to cognitive bias. It is innate, it is built into our brains, so we constantly have to be self-critical because we might accidentally be doing things, thinking about things that aren't necessarily what we want. Another one is putting our thoughts into a conscious platform. So the best case scenario is when you're evaluating something, or maybe you're looking at job candidates, maybe you're evaluating a presidential candidate. We think things, and a lot of times if it doesn't get into a platform, we type it out, we write it out. Our subconscious is playing more of a role than our conscious. So if you have an opinion on something, try writing it out. Sometimes even talking out loud about why you think the way that you're thinking can force us to be a little bit more specific, and it can tease out some of those cognitive biases. Another one is keep an open mind and recognize that stereotypes are inevitable, right? So we overgeneralize all the time, and it's part of the heuristics. It's the way our brain operates. Our brain constantly wants to help be efficient, and so that is good, but it's also bad, and that sometimes it makes us overgeneralize and engage in stereotypes that aren't necessarily true. So being forced to be open-minded can be helpful. And then objectivity, before, not after the situation. So try to be quantitative with your evaluation of whatever it might be before the case. So in the presidential debate scenario, what do you want in a president? Think about it first before you start watching and evaluating presidents. I want someone that's adaptive. I want someone that's values driven. I want someone that believes in policy X, Y, and Z, whatever it is. Think about it, quantify it before you start evaluating. And we do this in tracking. This is like best practices in HR all the time. Before you start evaluating resumes, you have to start objectifying exactly what you want this person to look like in terms of their underlying characteristics, not look like physically. What are their job skills? What are their roles going to be? What types of behaviors do you expect? Put those on paper first and then start evaluating, and hopefully even blinded so that you're not necessarily evaluating someone by looking at them, to then match it up before you start making decisions, because our mind will play tricks on us if we don't do that analysis first. So, okay. Those are all of the diversity items that I want to cover for now. So again, keep in mind, surface level diversity is different than deep level diversity. We need deep level diversity to also make sure that we have inclusion, because that helps facilitate some of the surface level diversity. We can partake in legal approaches. We can also have creative business solutions. And then there's also some best practices for what organizations can do, and there's best practices for what individuals can do. But as always, it's a work in progress. It's not perfect, but over the arc of history, we're making progress and we're doing good things. But there will be bumps along the way, and you're a part of that. All right, thanks.